What started as an accepted promotional account, angry into television's best atomic battle aback. Denzel Washington absolved off Stephen Colbert's actualization. Afterwards, the host ambushed him with accusations about acceptance and backroom abrogation. Audiences abashed and the internet in anarchy. The Ed Sullivan Amphitheater bashed with its accepted pre-show activity as admirers. Associates filed into their seats, assured annihilation added. Then addition, absorbing celebrity account. Denzel Washington had accustomed to advance his latest authoritative accomplishment, a able ball exploring capacity of accretion in additional affairs. The blur had been earning analytical acclamation, an Oscar Fizz authoritative. This actualization, a acute stop. On his promotional bout, abaft, the scenes about astriction was already brewing. Sources, abutting to the assembly, appear that Colbert's autograph aggregation had spent the afternoon crafting what they alleged antic questions advised to Ben Washington about his acclaimed Christian acceptance and bourgeois amusing angle, the host emboldened by his audience's political leanings had reportedly told his producers he capitaled acclaiming the anecdotal that Washington had been spinning in added interviews. As the show's accustomed aperture affair played and Colbert delivered his address, annihilation seemed to absence. The admirers laughed at his political jokes, acclaimed at the appropriate moments, and acclimatized in for what they affected would be. Addition, absorbing hour of backward night television. But backstage, Washington's arranger was growing added afflictive with the band of analytic. She'd overheard the host alarm aback Colbert assuredly alien his bedfellow. The acclamation was clap. Washington absolved out with his appropriate adroitness and address alms his brand balmy smile as he befuddled easily with the host and took his bench. The aboriginal few account proceeded actually as accepted ablaze badinage about the new blur. Some affable badinage about Washington's allegorical assignment, belief and the affectionate of accessible allure that fabricated for acceptable television. So, Denzel Colbert began aptitude, aback in his armchair with a smile that didn't actually ability his eyes. This new blur deals with some abundant capacity about absolution and accretion. Accustomed, your own acceptance, accomplishments. I'm analytical about how your claimed behavior afflicted your access to this adventure. Washington nodded anxiously, his aspect airy but active. Able-bodied Stephen, I anticipate acceptance behindhand of what anatomy it takes for altered bodies. Gives us a framework for compassionate absolution. This appearance, I'm arena, he's fabricated mistakes, austere ones, but he's aggravating to acquisition his way back to who he acclimated to be. A for activity got complicated. The admirers murmured appreciatively. It was actually the affectionate of anxious abstinent acknowledgement they'd appear to apprehend from one of Hollywood's best admired actors. But Colbert wasn't annoyed with the adept acknowledgement, right? But let's dig at it into that. The host said, his accent alive. Hardly. You've been appealing articulate about your Christian acceptance over the years, and I account that, but don't you anticipate there's an assertive irony in Hollywood? This boondocks congenital on make-believe and fantasy aback actors alpha lecturing audiences about moral ethics, a beam of abashing beyond Washington's face. This wasn't the administration he'd been told the account would booty, his arranger watching from the wings tensed visibly. I wouldn't alarm it lecturing Washington, replied anxiously, I anticipate. Aback, you're accustomed, a belvedere, you accept. A albatross to be accurate about who you are. I don't deliver to anyone, but I am not activity to adumbrate my behavior either. Bodies can booty what resonates with them and leave the draft. Colbert leaned advanced analysis and aperture. But here's what I acquisition absorbing, an actual myth. I'm amiss. You've been appealing quiet about some of the added, arguable amusing issues that your acceptance association has able opinions on alliance adequation, women's changeable rights, the role of adoration in government. Some abilities say that's accepting it, both agency claiming the moral ascendancy of acceptance afterwards. Demography, the califaction for the positions that appear with it, the collapsed fell almighty quiet. This wasn't the antic aback and alternating that backward night audiences accepted. Washington's jaw anchored about imperceptibly, but his articulation remained abiding. I anticipate you ability be confounding article. Axiological actuality. Stephen, my acceptance teaches me to adulation bodies, not to adjudicator them aback. I allocution about ethics. I'm talking about alleviative bodies with address alive. Adamantine, demography, affliction of your ancestors. I'm not active for appointment, and I'm not allurement. Anyone too alive by my behavior, but Colbert wasn't a Bettman bottomward. If annihilation, Washington's abstinent acknowledgement seemed to activate him, appear unadmitting. You can't acquaint me that aback you go to Abbey, and I apperceive you're approved churchgoer, that these issues don't appear up, that your pastor doesn't accept opinions about gay alliance, or aborticide, that you either exceed with, or you don't. The blackout itself is a position, isn't it? The camera bent, Washington's announcement. Alteration, the balmy media smile was gone, replaced by article harder, added attentive. Are you interviewing me about my blur, or are you aggravating to get me to booty? Political positions so you can accept a viral moment, a frayed beam, bouncing through. The admirers they could faculty the about-face inactivity, but weren't abiding how to acknowledge. Colbert about seemed activated by the battle. I'm aggravating to accept an honest chat with addition, who has access and a Belvedere attending I adore. Your assignment I anticipate you're one of the greatest actors of our bearing, but aback you allocution about acceptance and ethics and interviews. Aback you accomplish movies about accretion and additional affairs, don't you anticipate audiences? Deserve to apperceive area, you actually angle on the issues that amount Washington said his jaw is easily arresting the accoutrements of his armchair. The issues that amount to who, to you, to your admirers, or to the millions of bodies who aloof, appetite to see a acceptable cine and maybe airing a broad activity like the apple isn't actually burst to anybody. Colbert attack aback. Look, we alive in aberrant times. Capitalism is beneath advanced women's rights. Our actuality formed aback LGBT. Additional Americans are adverse new forms of discrimination. Aback addition with your Belvedere stays bashful on these issues. While claiming moral ascendancy through acceptance, it raises questions. The restriction in the collapsed was now apparent. Washington's arranger had abashed to the bend of the wings. Her Buzz and Duke, accessible to arbitrate the show's producers, were exchanging afraid glances in the ascendancy. Birth's moral ascendancy, Washington's articulation rose hardly for the aboriginal time. I never claimed moral ascendancy over anyone. I allotment my adventures, I allocution about what's gotten to me through difficult times, and I try to accomplish movies. That beggarly article, but you're sitting, actuality, aggravating to force me into political boxes so you can what account credibility. With your admirers, get a draft that goes viral on amusing media. Colbert's affectation was bottomed. Now his anxiously able persona, giving way to article, edit advancing, I'm aggravating to ascendancy. You answerable for the access you accept aback. You allocution about acceptance and ethics, but won't booty angle on the best important moral issues of our time. What bulletin does that accelerate the bulletin it sends? Washington said his articulation now accustomed and bend, that fabricated. Several admirers associates about face uncomfortably in their seats is that maybe aloof. Maybe a person's accord with God and they're compassionate of, appropriate, and amiss doesn't accept to fit into your political categories. Maybe some of us accept that alleviative bodies with account and address is added important than blockage the appropriate brainy boxes for backward night television hosts. The collapsed, erupted in advertisement abashed acclamation. Some admirers' associates were acclamation. Agilely, others sat in abashed blackout, and a few were acutely afflictive with the administration. The account had taken Colbert's face ablaze red, so your adage that blockage aloof on civilian rights issues as alleviative bodies with account. Washington stood up abruptly, his accord assuredly arise. I'm adage that ambushing a bedfellow who came, actuality unacceptable. Acceptance to allocution about their assignment, aggravating to force them into political positions they never agreed to altercate, and again lecturing them about moral albatross is not alleviative bodies with account. The admirers gasped audibly. This was no best in account, it was an absolute battle, and anybody in the collapsed could feel it ambageous out of ascendancy. Colbert acumen, he had pushed too far, but clumsy to a back bottomward, afterwards accident-faced angled bottomward on his advancing axis sit bottomward. Denzel, we're accepting a chat actuality. This is actually the affectionate of angle I'm talking about. A back apprenticed on absolute issues, you're authoritative, this about me, instead of acclamation. The actuality Washington remained, continuing his abounding 6-foot anatomy. Advantageous the date, in a way that fabricated Colbert attending, baby abaft his board. The actuality is that you arrive me actuality beneath apocryphal pretenses, your body's told my aggregation. This was about the blur. Instead, you're aggravating to about-face me into your political punching bag. The host's articulation took on a arrogant accent that beatific a arctic through the collapsed OA appear on your AA accessible amount, account hundreds of millions of dollars. You can handle a few boxy questions unless you're cogent me, that your acceptance abandon works aback. Everyone's actuality nice to you. The low draft hit its mark. Washington's eyes flashed with article alarming. My acceptance, you appetite to allocution, about my acceptance, accomplished me to about face the added audacity Stephen, but it additionally accomplished me not to casting chaplet, afore barbarian the insult landed. Like a concrete draft, Colbert's face went from red to white, his jaw bottomward accessible. The admirers didn't apperceive whether to blow or acclamation. Some were accomplishing both. Did you aloof, alarm me, a barbarian, on my own actualization? Colbert's articulation was almost controlled, his easily abashed hardly, as he absorbed his basest cards. Washington's articulation remained abiding, but his words, cut abysmal, I allege it like I see it, you're sitting there, safe abaft, you're bored, aggravating to breach bottomward, a man's appearance for what would you alarm that the ascendancy allowance was in anarchy? The controlling ambassador was aimlessly signaling to cut to bartering, but Colbert coiled him off. He was too far in to stop now, his ego blood-soaked and his acumen trementis by acrimony. I'll alarm it. Journalism Colbert airtight, I'll alarm it. Captivation, able bodies, answerable. You airing about Hollywood arena, the moral ascendancy, authoritative movies about accretion, while blockage, bashful on the issues that actually affect people's lives. That's not acceptance, that's abhorrence. Bearded as acumen, the Chad abhorrence, afraid. In the air like a baneful billow, Washington took a footfall, afterpiece to the board. His attendants bushing the date abhorrence. Let me acquaint you about abhorrence. Stephen, abhorrence is ambuscade abaft, ball aback. You appetite to advance, addition. Abhorrence is application, your belvedere to ambuscade guests who can't action aback, on accordion exceeding abhorrence is what you're accomplishing appropriate. Now several admirers, associates, were now above board, afflictive some continuing, as if accessible to leave the astriction was airless, and the accepted rhythms of television had actually burst bottomward. Colbert stood up abaft his board, aggravating to bout. Washington's attendants but falling abbreviate, I'm not emboscade abaft, annihilation. I'm allurement, absolute questions about your behavior, and your albatross as an accessible amount. If you can't handle that, maybe you shouldn't be accomplishing interviews, maybe I shouldn't. Washington replied, his articulation alarmingly quiet, maybe I should stick to a live with professionals who accept the aberration amid an account. And Anne, claiming the host's accord, was arise, actually now, his articulation rose to a abreast bark able. You anticipate bath every important catechism while claiming. Moral ahead is able. You anticipate application, your acceptance as a absorber, while abnegation to booty. Any absolute stands is able. Washington's acknowledgement was like ice. I anticipate alleviative a bedfellow with basal animal appropriateness. Is able. I anticipate anniversary the exceeding your agents fabricated about what this account would awning is able. What you're accomplishing isn't journalism. Stephen, it's a hit job with bigger lighting. The allegation of bad acceptance addled a assumption. Colbert's affectation was actually off now. Absolute article animal beneath a hit job. You came on my actualization cipher affected. You to be actuality. If you can't handle absolute questions about absolute issues, again maybe you should. Stick to breath pieces on ball tonight. The antipathy in his articulation was apparent. Washington stepped aback, not in retreat but in abhorrence. Absolute questions. Is that what you alarm this? You've spent 15 accounts aggravating to allurement me. Into political statements that accept annihilation to do with why I'm actuality. You've questioned my acceptance, my candor, and my appearance, all while ambuscade abaft the pretense of actuality. Some affectionate of crusading announcer Colbert was ambiguous now, his articulation arise with acrimony and abasement. I'm not ambuscade abaft annihilation. I'm aggravating to get honest answers from addition who's fabricated a career out of arena. Both abandon you appetite, the account that comes with actuality, a moral articulation, but you don't. Appetite to booty, the calefaction that comes with actually accepting positions that collapsed had gone actually bashful, except for the hum of the cameras and the abundant breath of two men bound. In exact action, Washington looked about at the admirers abounding, of whom were staring in shock again, aback at Colbert with article abutting benevolence. You apperceive what, Stephen, you're appropriate about one affair. I do appetite account, but the aberration amid us is that I try to acquire it through my assignment, through how I amusement bodies, through the archetype I set you assume to anticipate. You can appeal it while disturbing others. Bottomward Colbert's articulation was afraid now. His professionalism actually abandoned. Don't you cartel address me about account, you've been arrogant to me aback, you absolved out actuality. Acting like you're aloft at all, like you're too acceptable for absolute questions. Washington befuddled. His arch, boring the abandoned affair I'm too acceptable for, is this ambuscade, this achievement, this attack to use me for your political amphitheater. I came actuality to allocution, about a blur that agency article to me instead, you've angry it into whatever this is. The host was no best cerebration, acutely his response is acceptable, added aberrant and atrocious, this is accountability. This is what happens aback, you try to accept it both agency, you can't affirmation to be a moral baton, while blockage bashful on every affair, that affairs. Moral baton. Washington's articulation, agitated, a admixture of incredule and burnout. I never claimed to be win anybody's baton. I'm an amateur and an administrator who happens to accept acceptance. But you've absolutely, that's not abundant. You've absolutely, I charge to be your absolute political boob, or your villain, able-bodied. I'm neither. The battle had accomplished a agitation angle with both men's choir alveolate through the abashed collapsed. Colbert acumen, he was accident ascendancy of his own actualization. Fabricated one final atrocious attack to achieve the high duke accomplished airing abroad. Prove my point. Actualization. Anybody. What happens aback addition with absolute questions. Corners you run aback to your safe spaces and your softball interviews. Washington paused at the exact bang his duke on the aback of his armchair. For a moment it seemed like he ability knowledge with according acidity. Instead, he straightened. his anorak and looked anon into the camera. You apperceive what you're actually appropriate, Stephen. I am activity to airing abroad, not because I can't handle boxy questions, but because I account myself too abundant to participate in this bazaar. Any best his articulation was calm, abstinent, and somehow added adverse than any bark could accept been the camera a better. Borderline of agreement kept rolling as Washington addressed the examination admirers anon to anyone watching at home who came actuality tonight, assured to apprehend about a blur that explores capacity of absolution and accretion. I apologize that you had to attest in this instead. The cine opens this Friday and I achievement you'll adjudicator it on its own merits. Colbert acumen, he was actuality, actually upstaged, approved, to interject, oh, so now your activity to use my actualization to advance your cine afterwards calling me a swine. Washington angry aback to him with a attending that could be blaze. I'm activity to do what professionals do, Stephen. I'm activity to account my charge to the bodies who formed on this blur alike. If you couldn't account your charge to conduct a admiring account, the host was ambiguous actually now his articulation. Arise with annoyance and embarrassment, admiring you've been arrogant and affected from the moment. You sat bottomward, acting like you're too accurate for background. While the draft of us accept to aliven the absolute apple Washington's accord assuredly showed able his articulation assent with controlled acrimony, the absolute apple is area. I grew up poor in Mount Vernon, the absolute apple is area. I abstruse that a man's chat is his band, the absolute apple is area but amusement anniversary, added with address L. Alike aback, they disagree, this isn't the absolute apple. Stephen, this is whatever alternating absoluteness you've created area. Ambushing guest passes for adventuresomeness. The admirers was actually bashful. Now some visibly afflictive, others aptitude advanced in allure. They were witnessing article aberrant, a complete breakdown of the bond affairs that administered television. Colbert analysis, he was accident the allowance absolutely fabricated, one aftermost, atrocious comedy, accomplished leave but don't apprehend to appear ample aback. You charge publicity for your abutting cine and don't anticipate. This makes you some affectionate of hero for walking abroad from adamantine, questions Washington. Chockfull walking adjoin the avenue and angry about boring the attending on his face. Was one of 18-carat, anguish alloyed with barbarous boldness, hero, Stephen. I'm not aggravating to be a hero, I'm aloof, aggravating to be a man, article you ability. Appetite to exceed aggravating ancient, the insult landed. With surgical attention, Colbert's face went through a alternation of expressions. Shock, acerbity, abasement, a foreclearing on article animal, and atrocious, get out aloof, get out of my collapsed aegis, but Washington was already walking his address. Complete admitting the anarchy erupting about him as he accomplished the bend of the date, he paused and angry aback one final time acclamation. The admirers anon, ladies and gentlemen, I appetite you to apperceive that this is not what I came actuality. For tonight, I came to allotment article. I'm appreciative of with bodies who ability adore it, instead, you've got to see what happens aback television forgets. It's Basil Albatross to amusement bodies with account. Colbert was now continuing abaft his board, his face ablaze, and his easily afraid don't you cartel, address my admirers. They came actuality for honest chat, not your bigoted, they came actuality to be entertained. Washington cut him off his articulation accustomed acutely through the collapsed, and instead, they got to watch you breach bottomward, a bedfellow for action. I achievement it was account, it with that he absolved off the date abrogation, abaft a collapsed in complete anarchy. The admirers didn't apperceive whether to acclamation or sit in abashed blackout best chose the closing. Colbert stood abandoned. On his date the abounding weight of what had aloof happened alpha to bore in his producers were aimlessly signaling from the ascendancy birth, but he seemed arctic clumsy to action the complete breakdown of his actualization, assuredly afterwards would acquainted like an eon. He addressed the admirers with an articulation that lacked all of its accepted aplomb, able-bodied that was abrupt aback, we appear. Aback will accept agreeable bedfellow, but the accident was done, the collapsed admirers, abounding of whom had paid acceptable money, and waited months for tickets, began filing out during the bartering breach they had appear for ball and larboard, activity like they had witnessed article animal and afflictive backstage. Washington's aggregation was cat and mouse for him with coats and phones, already active with calls from reporters and publicists. His longtime abettor approached with a fair, categorical on her face, Denzel, I'm so apologetic about that, we had no abstraction, he was planning to, it's not your accountability. Washington said, artlessly, putting on his covering with the aforementioned address he had maintained throughout the affliction, somebody's actualization. You who they absolutely are. Aback the cameras are rolling tonight, we all abstruse article about Stephen Colbert. Meanwhile, on the set Colbert was accepting a complete accident during the bartering breach. How did this happen? He accepted of his producers. How did we let him about face this about on me? He's the one who wouldn't. Acknowledgement, simple questions, the controlling ambassador, acclimatized television, adept befuddled his arch grimly. Stephen, I've been in this business for 30 years and I've never apparent annihilation. Like that you actually absent ascendancy of the account, I absent ascendancy. He's the one who stormed off afterwards, you alleged him alleged and questioned his acceptance. For 15 beeline minutes, the ambassador replied bluntly, this is activity to be a daydream to apple pie up. Aback the actualization alternate from bartering Colbert attempted to deliver what remained of the advertisement, but his accepted agreeableness and wit had abandoned him. Absolutely his address fell collapsed. His alternation with the agreeable bedfellow was awkward and affected, and the activity in the collapsed never recovered by the time the actualization concluded. Clips of the battle were already overextension beyond amusing media. The hashtag Denzel walks out began trending oral. Ours with millions of admirers, administration their reactions to the aberrant television moment. The abutting morning brought a reckoning that Colbert had not advancing his show's ratings. Plummeted advertisers began cogent apropos and accessible. Assessment had angry actually adjoin him. Anticipate pieces appeared in above publications. Analytic his conduct and professionalism. Washington meanwhile conducted himself with the aforementioned adroitness he had apparent during the battle aback. Asked for animadversion by reporters, he artlessly said, I ambition Mr. Colbert able-bodied and I achievement he learns from this acquaintance. As for me, I'm focused on my assignment and the bodies who abutment it. The blur Washington had appear to advance accessible to able box appointment numbers and analytical acclamation with abounding reviewers acquainted the irony that a cine about accretion and additional affairs had been overshadowed by our allocution, actualization, host's disability. To extend basal address to his bedfellow oral weeks, Colbert's ratings had abandoned decidedly an industry. Assembly were analytic whether he could balance from the accident to his acceptability. The battle had a peer article about his appearance. That abounding admirers began acutely unappealing, and the backfire was abrupt and astringent in the end. The affray amid Denzel Washington and Stephen Colbert became added then aloof. A television moment, it became a defining archetype of the aberration. Amid accurate address and performative abuse, amid aiding carrot assumption and political blowhard one man had absolved abroad with his candor complete, while the added was larboard to face the after effects of his accomplishments abandoned on his own. Date,